Hello everybody, this is a part 2, so make sure to check out my previous video on Springtime of Nations if you haven't already. In the time since making the first video, Sun made a new video talking about collective force. I dealt with some of that in his updated positions in the comment section of my last video, but it should be noted that the mere existence of the new video confirms that Sun admits that the analysis of what is property in the first video was incorrect. Nevertheless, an analysis of the video that is still in circulation, insinuating that these famous anarchists were virtually identical to anarcho-capitalists, still needs to be deconstructed. I also want to explain my position on whether anarcho-capitalists are anarchists. My personal opinion is that they aren't, and I really do not care if they are considered anarchists or not, but that is not why I make these videos. The goal of this channel is to introduce neo-Proudhonian thought in easily digestible videos, and to do that I need to dispel misconceptions about the man, the myth, the legend. Consider any additional arguments about whether they are anarchists to be cherries on top of the sundae. With that out of the way, let's continue, shall we?
Well, apparently Bakunin could tell a lie in the moment of death, because he basically ignored this, and chose to interpret Proudhon as advocating collectivization of property. Now, as you might expect, the executor of Proudhon's estate, Gustave Chaudet, was having none of this. The two men were now set on a collision course, and this would become apparent in the early meetings of both the First International, as well as another group with largely overlapping membership, the League of Peace and Freedom. The League of Peace and Freedom was formed in response to the growing tension between France and Prussia, and sought to prevent the two powers from going to war. However, in practice, they often ended up debating about random things they disagreed on. Naturally, one of those things was property. In the organization's second annual Congress at Bern, Switzerland, members voted on what the official position of the group should be on the collectivizing of privately owned land, which, again, I'm not really sure why that needs to be voted on in an organization that was formed to prevent war between France and Prussia, but whatever. Chaudet, along with most of the self-described anarchists, voted against that collectivization proposition, which made sense since at the time, anarchist largely meant someone who held Proudhon's views more or less. However, Bakunin emerged as the leader of a new faction of self-described anarchists, who called themselves collectivists. They voted with the likes of Karl Marx and other state socialists to collectivize property. Fortunately, though, despite this defection, the Proudhonists still won the vote. As Chaudet would recount in a letter, "We have done a good enough job at Bern. I found myself in hand-to-hand combat with the famous Bakunin, the Russian revolutionary, carrying in his wake all the collectivists, or partisans of collective property. It's a new word for that old tune of communism. They also have a way of conceiving of the federalist idea, which, by expanding it and letting it spread and go well beyond the concrete is the true realism, reduce it to a pure abstraction, a chimera, an imperceptible generality, a sentimental banality. We fought all of that robustly and firmly, and, with a complete victory, we reconstituted the League of Peace on a serious and robust foundation." This further entrenched the divide between the Individualists under Chaudet and the Collectivists under Bakunin.
Sun starts to cover the split between the Mutualists and the Collectivists. Of course, he does this with his Anarcho-Capitalist flair. The conflicts that happen between Bakunin and Chaudet do mark a particular split between the two factions. Still, it should be put into the context of what the Mutualist-Collectivist split was actually about. Bakunin's attempt to steer the League of Peace and Freedom brought him into conflict with a variety of good radicals, while the setback faced by the French followers of various kinds of Proudhonian thought imposed distance between them and other factions that might, under other conditions, have been allies. Collectivist and mutualist currents do start to split with Bakunin in the picture. Again, we need to look at what the actual split between the collectivists and mutualists were, which the difference were highly exaggerated for the sake of the video. Given their role in setting up the International, the Mutualists dominated the agenda in its first years. According to the standard and usually Marxist or Marxist-influenced accounts of the International, this initial domination by the Mutualists was eclipsed by the rise of a collectivist current, usually is identified with Marxism. This is not entirely true. Yes, the Basel Congress of 1869 saw the success of a collectivist motion which was opposed by Tolaine and some of his French internationalists, but this was a debate on the specific issue of agricultural collectivization rather than a rejection of mutualism as such. The endorsement of collectivism by the Basel Congress might appear to be a rejection of the French position on cooperatives. Actually, it was not, for collectivism, as it was defined by its proponents, meant simply the end of private ownership of agricultural land. Lumped together with this was usually the demand for common ownership of mines and railways. Thus, it was not a debate over cooperative production in favor of some other model, but rather concerned with its extension to agriculture. And so, it must be restated that this isn't as big of a split as Sun is trying to make it for the video. Some of these collectivist positions were held by Proudhon as well. For example, at the Lausanne Congress of 1867, the Mutualists around Tolaine acknowledged the necessity of public ownership of canals, roads, and mines, and there was unanimous accord on public ownership of the means of transportation and exchange of goods. This was Proudhon's position as well. The proponents of collectivization at the Lausanne Congress wanted to extend Tolaine's ideas to all property. Don't be fooled when Sun bombastically asserts that the, quote, individualist Proudhonians won against the communistic collectivists. The divide wasn't like he was asserting, and the evolving tendencies took much more to develop into what we know today as a communist anarchism. The exact elements of what makes Proudhon's mutualism so individualistic is never elaborated in his video.
And caused Bakunin to grow closer to Marx. In fact, in a letter to Marx shortly after this incident, Bakunin would write, "I understand better than ever how right you are in following and inviting us all to march on the wide road of economic revolution, and in denigrating those among us who would lose themselves on the paths of either national or exclusively political enterprises." This is probably a swipe at Sade. "I now do what you yourself commenced to do more than 20 years ago. Since the solemn and public farewells that I addressed to the bourgeois at the Bern Congress, I have known no other society, no other milieu than the world of the workers. My homeland now is the International, of which you are one of the principal founders. So you see, dear friend, that I am your disciple, and I am proud to be it." Unfortunately, despite losing the vote, Bakunin would begin to lead other anarchists down this same road with him.
Sun really tries to emphasize how Bakunin was developing away from Proudhon and closer to Marxism, but Marx was someone whom Bakunin and many individualist anarchists have taken a considerable amount of ideas from. If Sun wants to insinuate that someone taking ideas from Marx is inherently communistic, then he should turn towards these individualists he tries to rely on to justify anarcho-capitalism's place within anarchism. By the death of Karl Marx, the cause of labor has lost one of the most faithful friends it ever had. Liberty says thus much in hearty tribute to the sincerity and hearty steadfastness of the man who, perhaps to a greater extent than any other, represented by nature and by doctrine the principle of authority which we live to combat. Anarchism knew in him its bitterest enemy, and yet every anarchist must hold his memory in respect. Strangely mingled feelings of admiration and abhorrence are simultaneously inspired in us by contemplation of this great man's career. Toward the two fundamental principles of the revolution today, he occupied an exactly contradictory attitude. Intense as was his love of equality, no less so was his hatred of liberty. The former found expression in one of the most masterly expositions of the infamous nature and office of capital ever put into print. The latter in a sweeping scheme of state supremacy and absorption, involving a practical annihilation of the individual. The enormous service done by the one was well-nigh neutralized by the injurious effects resulting from his advocacy of the other. For Karl Marx, the egalitaire, we feel the profoundest respect. As for Karl Marx, the authoritaire, we must consider him an enemy. Liberty said as much in its first issue and sees no reason to change its mind. He was an honest man, a strong man, a humanitarian, and the promulgator of much vitally important truth. But on the most vital question of politics and economy, he was persistently and irretrievably mistaken. Benjamin Tucker, like many individualist anarchists, was mostly mirroring the sentiment of most anarchists, including Mikhail Bakunin, who was a fervent lover of Marx the egalitaire, yet very critical of Marx the authoritaire. Bakunin writes more about this in his book Marxism, Freedom, and the State, which is a very famous anarchist text.
And when Bakunin died in 1876, European anarchism would drift still farther from its Proudhonist origins. At the 1877 meeting, the Italian section of the St. Imier Congress, led by a man named Enrico Malatesta, would announce their allegiance to what they called Anarcho-Communism, an ideology inspired by the teachings of one of Proudhon's biggest enemies, Joseph de Jacques. With Bakunin now dead and unable to argue against them, they convinced most of the other anarcho-collectivists to follow suit, and then proceeded to dissolve the Congress, the final death blow to the old European anarchist movement based around Proudhon.
But it was not dead, and as the father of anarchism, Proudhon necessarily influences all anarchist movements, since they all develop from his ideas of mutualism in their own directions. Just claiming that people only bring up Proudhon because of his thesis that property is theft is not sufficient to totally dismiss his influence in all branches of anarchism that stem from him. The point anarchists make when they bring up Proudhon in this context is that anarcho-capitalists reject the core thrust of Proudhonian ideas which permeate every strain of anarchism.
So, that's the depressing tragedy of European anarchism. Proudhon spent 25 years from 1840 to 1865 building up a movement which, while not perfectly aligned with modern anarcho-capitalism, was quite close to it.
It should be certain to anyone by now that Proudhon was not anywhere close to anarcho-capitalism. Exactly what Proudhon's mutualism entails was never elaborated by Sun other than vague gestures to some out-of-context quotes. This is because Sun cannot make this argument in any substantive measure. This is a message to all AnCaps. Please refrain from gushing over Proudhon all over Reddit. He is not your friend, he is your enemy.
Then in the next 12 years, it completely fell apart, descending first into collectivism and then outright communism before having its main organization dissolved entirely. The movement went from being close to Gustave de Molinari but disagreeing about interest, to being close to Karl Marx but disagreeing about the exact timing of getting rid of the state.
Although modern anarcho-communists are closer to Karl Marx than Proudhonian mutualists were, for reasons I hope are obvious for anyone familiar with how the linear movement of time works, there is not anything that substantiates any claim that puts anarcho-capitalism as a natural successor to Proudhon's ideas. In the case of anarcho-communism, there have been substantive parts of Proudhon that have been naturally added to, modified, or sometimes left out, but it still remains a development of his mutualist ideas. This is not the case with anarcho-capitalism, which does not take any substantive or even any influence from the man and instead feels the strange urge to portray him as a pro-capitalist. But isn't this peculiar that Sun hasn't actually engaged with any of Proudhon's actual arguments relating to property or capitalism?
But the flame was not extinguished. Across the Atlantic in America, a young anarchist named Benjamin Tucker had watched with dismay the disintegration of the European anarchist movement, and had resolved to do his best to set it straight. Tucker did not judge Bakunin nearly as harshly as I do, but he had a deep contempt for the self-proclaimed anarcho-communists who had bastardized Proudhon's movement, anarchism. In 1881, at the age of 27, Tucker launched an anarchist magazine called Liberty, wherein he and many others would effectively argue for the views of the original anarchist movement.
Benjamin Tucker's anarchism was not the same as Proudhon's, despite existing under the same title of mutualism, an already broad label to say the least. I explained the difference in my last video, so check that out to find out what differentiates them. This is a commonly recognized divide between mutualism, currently between the Neo-Proudhonians and the Neo-Tuckerites. As we have seen earlier, Tucker wasn't exactly a completely faithful disciple of Proudhon, as he let his own anti-communism seep into his interpretation and translations of Proudhon. Tucker himself developed his own ideas pretty independently, taking from Josiah Warren, Proudhon, Max Stirner, and Karl Marx. He was not completely faithful to any doctrine and took elements from many sources to form his own anti-monopolistic perspective. And again, both communists and individualists made use of Proudhon and developed his ideas in different directions, directly or indirectly, and thus Sun moves his focus to America and some of the Boston anarchists and individualists.
Tucker's largely American audience were not easily swayed by collectivism. Partly, as Karl Marx would observe, because of the difference in context between America and Europe. While Europe had a lot of concentrated wealth and land directly left over from feudalism, America had huge tracts of previously unowned wilderness, which was claimed and settled by relatively poor people who made their fortunes through voluntary transaction. While there were, of course, many abuses enabled by the state, such as slavery and the genocide of Native Americans, America was clearly more of a blank state than Europe. So Proudhon's good property and bad property were substantially less entangled than they had been in Europe.
As we've seen before, with direct quotation from Proudhon, he was not differentiating between good and bad property. In fact, he states multiple times otherwise. His actual limited endorsement of property as liberty was in a very specific circumstance where its absolutist characteristics were counterbalanced and equalized with the state. Sean P. Wilbur writes, as the claim that the property that Proudhon identifies with liberty is not in principle the same as the property he identifies with theft or robbery, Proudhon refuted that directly in the theory of property, the work that people treat as his most friendly of property. But there again, if you understand the work, which involves balancing undesirable institutions against one another, the scheme only works if the property potentially useful to liberty, when stripped of the right to profit and divided equally, of course, remains property that is theft. The theory of property is what anarcho-capitalists like to cite for Proudhon being friendly to private property, and a complete discussion of it would be very inefficient use of time for this video. I promise to make a video on the manuscripts soon enough, but for anyone familiar with Proudhon, the evidence hitherto provided should make anyone skeptical about these bombastic claims that capitalists might make about the posthumously collected manuscripts. As we start to see, Tucker's anti-monopolism is very attractive to anarcho-capitalists, but is it enough to get them enough evidence to proclaim themselves anarchists? Let's find out.
Nevertheless, like Proudhon, Tucker identified anarchism as a movement fundamentally aligned with labor in its quest to eliminate legal privilege and monopoly, which he believed would result in the elimination of interest and a more egalitarian society favorable to workers. As he would put it, laissez-faire was very good sauce for the goose, labor, but was very poor sauce for the gander, capital. For this reason, Tucker continued to identify as a socialist. In addition to his view that the free market would eliminate usury, he also believed that it would largely do away with rent. This is something you also often see floated by modern fake anarchists as proof that his views were incompatible with modern anarcho-capitalism. But again, when you look into the specifics of his views, that doesn't really hold up. In an exchange with one of Liberty's readers, who went by the pseudonym Egoist, Tucker explained why he thinks that rent won't occur, or will at least be less common under free market anarchy. The correspondence is very long, but to summarize, he says that the cost of hiring a person or a private defense company to defend a piece of land is often greater than the value of the rent you would be able to charge for that land. And so it would not be profitable to attempt to charge people rent. He says that the reason people are able to do this now is because the state exists and subsidizes absentee ownership by protecting everyone's land for free with police. Modern anarcho-capitalists tend to disagree with this reasoning. But just like his and Proudhon's position on interest, this really just amounts to different economic predictions about the free market. It is true that Tucker hoped things would turn out that way, but that's really the same position as our left libertarian friends at C4SS hold. And although they, like Tucker, don't like to call themselves capitalist for these reasons, they don't go around claiming that AnCaps aren't real anarchists the way that modern commies do. It should be also pointed out that Tucker did own multiple pieces of land, his personal home as well as his bookshop, Unique Books, in New York. Tucker ran that bookshop as a private business for a profit and had at least one employee there who was paid a wage.
Another delicious reminder that Sun hasn't actually read Tucker is that he acts as if rent isn't covered by Tucker's use of the word usury. As expected, Sun is trying to rely on the free market side of Tucker to connect the Frankenstein version of his ideology to him. I digress. Yes, Tucker did call himself a socialist, and he has explained why he did so, and let's see what he means by that. Socialism says that what's one man's meat must no longer be another's poison, that no man shall be able to add to his riches except by labor, and in adding to his riches by labor alone, no man makes another man poorer. That on the contrary, every man thus adding to his riches makes every other man richer. That increase and concentrations of wealth through labor tend to increase, cheapen, and vary production. That every increase of capital in the hands of the laborer tends, in the absence of legal monopoly, to put more products, better products, cheaper products, and the greater variety of products within the reach of every man who works, and that this fact means the physical, mental, and moral perfecting of mankind, the realization of human fraternity. Is that not glorious? Shall a word that means all that be cast aside simply because some have tried to wed it with authority? By no means. The man who subscribes to that, whatever he may think himself, whatever he may call himself, however bitterly he may attack the thing which he mistakes for socialism, is himself a socialist. And the man who subscribes to its opposite and acts upon its opposite, however benevolent he may be, however pious he may be, whatever his station in society, whatever his standing in the church, whatever his position in the state, is not a socialist, but a thief. For there are at bottom but two classes, the socialists and the thieves. Socialism practically is war upon usury in all its forms, the great anti-theft movement of the 19th century, and socialists are the only people to whom the preachers of morality have no right or occasion to cite the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. That commandment is socialism's flag, only not as a commandment, but as a law of nature. Socialism does not order it, prophesizes. It does not say, thou shalt not steal. It says, when all men have liberty, thou wilt not steal. Theft is identified by Tucker as what he calls usury, which, as we have explained before, is an umbrella term for rent, interest, and profit. Again, we have dispelled this myth that capitalism equals markets, but Tucker fits the bill to be called a socialist. In his works, he wants to socialize production, creating an economy where labor would be paid its full product, and any form of wage labor that may occur would not only be their full product, but have laborers in more power and control of their work than that of their employers. Please let me know who the anarcho-capitalist is who denies profit. Moving on to the claims about rent, again, the absurdity of connecting the practical means to the end with the entirety of the ideological movement is insufficient. Tucker objected to the landlordism as forms of the land monopoly, which uphold the systems of usury he criticized. A quote on the land monopoly by a fellow individualist, Clarence Lee Shorts, says that the land monopoly, or the enforcement of government of land titles which do not rest upon occupancy and use, maintains the usury of rent which affects every man, woman, and child in the country. Tucker again clarifies his prescriptions again in Individual Liberty. The land for the people, according to liberty, means the protection by the state while it exists, and afterwards by such voluntary association for the maintenance of justice as may be destined to succeed it, of all people who desire to cultivate land in the possession of whatever land they personally cultivate, without distinction between the existing classes of landlords, tenants, and laborers, and the positive refusal of the power of the protecting force to lend its aid to the collection of any rents whatsoever. This state of things to be brought about by inducing the people to steadily refuse the payment of rent and taxes, and thereby, as well as by all other means of passive and moral resistance, compel the state to repeal all the so-called land titles now existing. Tucker goes beyond simply the means with this, and says that rent should neither be paid nor enforced, and he also goes further. If we look at how Tucker treats the free market and compare anarcho-capitalists to the individualists based on the mere means of action, we still fail to see the big picture. For example, two ideological proponents may wish to achieve their aims by violent revolution, but that doesn't make their ideologies necessary extensions if one is meant to move towards hierarchy and the other equality. Just as Benjamin Tucker wanted to use market forces to secure the full product to laborers, it doesn't follow that he is a capitalist for his endorsement of market mechanisms to achieve his aims. The capitalist's aim is to keep workers working for limited wages and to leave them a fraction of their entire products, and to deny any unfair bargaining power between the capitalists and their workers, and to deny the inherently violent acts necessary for primitive accumulation to start capitalism. These aims are not anarchistic on the terms that Benjamin Tucker was, and any anarcho-capitalist who blames their shunning on their beliefs of markets is either lying or misunderstood. The aims of Benjamin Tucker were explicitly egalitarian, anarchistic, while anarcho-capitalists frequently deny the axiom of equality, usually on the basis that liberty is somehow incompatible with equality. Just because anarcho-capitalists deny that Tucker's plans would have worked because of their own Austrian economic perspective does not mean that their goals are the same. As Tucker and the market anarchists sought to liberate the laborer, so the anarcho-capitalists seek to liberate the bourgeois from the state, as if the state wasn't already a tool of capitalists. What Sun keeps proclaiming is just not true. The difference do not amount to just different economic perspectives. While mutualists recognize rent, interest, and profit are all forms of theft that should be gotten rid of, if the anarcho-capitalists' response to this is that these activities actually are beneficial, then go ahead. But do not proclaim yourselves natural successors to these anarchists if you reject the main thrust of their ideology. Moving on to C4SS, they do actually combat anarcho-capitalism in some of their articles, although not as harshly as I would like. Check out one article in the description on how Anna Morgenstern at C4SS thinks anarcho-capitalism is impossible. Kevin Carson also has responded to a lot of these anarcho-capitalist perspectives in his books. And actually, Carson actually does claim that anarcho-capitalism isn't anarchism in his article discussing the anarchist FAQ. Probably the most controversial aspect of the FAQ centers on the main reason it was written in the first place, to challenge Brian Kaplan's framing of left anarchism and right anarchism, i.e. anarcho-capitalism, as equally valid branches within the larger anarchist family tree. On that question, I would have to agree with McKay that anarcho-capitalism as such is not part of the historic anarchist movement, although I do not feel too strongly about it. You could have at least done one Google search, son. And finally, for the activities of Tucker listed, they do not seem to be terribly relevant, and Sun doesn't make an argument based on them. And let it be known that this is very thematic, since the whole video is just pointing to anarchists that anarcho-capitalists have slightly common ground on, and then letting the viewer associate the two without actually explaining how capitalism is compatible with their anarchisms. If you cut out all the filler, the video could have been made in under a minute, while still not lacking the essential arguments. Next, Sun begins to cover the rivalry between the Boston anarchists, the individualist anarchists, and the Chicago anarchists, which were the social anarchists. He then covers the Haymarket affair and its byproducts, getting to...
In the aftermath of this affair, Tucker responded in Liberty to the suggestion that his movement should stop calling itself anarchist in order to distance themselves from the bomb-throwing communist terrorists. Tucker was adamant that they stand their ground, writing, "My Wichita Falls comrade, Mr. Warren, falls into error when he accuses me of adapting the nomenclature of a class with whom no individualist could harmonize. Meaning, I suppose, by this class, the communists who call themselves anarchists. Is Mr. Warren aware that the Chicago men never dreamed of adopting the anarchist name until long after Liberty was started, and that the communistic anarchists of Europe did not so style themselves until nearly 40 years after Proudhon used the name, for the first time in the world, to designate a social philosophy? Proudhon was an individualist, and to him, and those who fundamentally agree with him, belongs, by right of discovery and use, the employment of the word anarchy in scientific terminology. We individualists hold the original title, and we do not propose to be evicted by the first upstart communist who comes along with a fraudulent claim."
It is not a secret that Tucker was a staunch anti-communist, and many Stirnerites have been as well. Nevertheless, it is still important to realize that Tucker's interpretation of Proudhon isn't actually representative of the man himself. Proudhon is hard to classify as either a social or an individualist anarchist. For example, Proudhon in What is Property states the third form of society that he pursues is the synthesis of community and property, which he would call liberty. To reiterate, this doesn't mean mutualism is simply a combination of both community and property. What he means is a synthesis, but I digress. The point is that Proudhon was a complicated figure that is hard to put into any boxes like individualists, which makes sense, since collectivistic and individualistic movements picked up when he died. Coming back to Tucker, his reasoning is sound on his use of nomenclature. In fact, this is the very same reason he calls himself a socialist. So if Sun wants to respect Tucker's reasoning here, he should look into that and stop claiming that these famous anarchists weren't actually socialists.
And despite this insistence, Tucker and his friends did in fact experiment with some other terminology for their ideas. In 1884, Tucker wrote in Liberty that the world is fast dividing itself into two schools, the authoritarians and the libertarians, the archists and the anarchists. And following this, he would occasionally refer to himself as a libertarian, although he preferred the word anarchist. So, are we to take the fact that Tucker is using de Jacques's term libertarian to mean that he considers himself on the same side as de Jacques? No, for a few reasons. First of all, if it's not clear by now, Tucker was a huge stan of Proudhon, who de Jacques hated. Secondly, although de Jacques did not actually use the word communism, he was clearly a communist, and as I've shown in a million quotes by now, Tucker hated communism.
From here on out, it must be kept in mind that Tucker was both a libertarian socialist and an anti-communist. Vague gestures relying on these facts are no longer going to be pointed out. Over the term libertarian, it depends on what Sun means by the same side. They are certainly on, quote, the same side, if you mean they are both anarchists, as they meet any qualifications. The argument that people on the left make is that libertarianism is meant to qualify a type of socialism historically, and that it has not meant a form of laissez-faire capitalism since the coming of the later 20th century. And as we've seen, since Tucker is a socialist, this isn't a problem. He fits the bill as a socialist, even if he was an anti-communist.
So, did Tucker steal the communist word libertarian? Well, you could say that, but there are some nuances here. De Jacques was a pretty obscure figure, so his use of the term libertarian did not catch on, even among the more anti-property anarchists. Bakunin, for example, did not call himself a libertarian. Even Malatesta, the self-proclaimed anarcho-communist who dissolved the International Workingmen's Association, did not immediately use that word. According to the Anarchist FAQ, which is a collectivist source, the next time the term was used by communists after 1861 was in 1880, when the phrase libertarian communism was used at an obscure regional conference in France. It's very possible Tucker was not even aware of this. After that, communists didn't start calling themselves libertarians again until 1892, when a communist named Jean Faure revived de Jacques's paper, The Libertarian, in French Algeria. This was several years after Tucker had already started using the term. So, I think it's fair to say that the communists were not really using the term libertarian at the time, and therefore, by the standard of occupancy and use, it was available to be homesteaded by the individualist anarchists. That is, the real anarchists.
Oh, the irony. The communists did use the term libertarian, and so did other socialists like Tucker. Sun using occupancy and use like it doesn't directly conflict with the prescriptions of anarcho-capitalism is very hilarious, since it directly goes against parasites like landlords, capitalists, and absentee owners. Although this video isn't directly about the word libertarian, the word was used simultaneously by both individualists and communists to my knowledge. And what I have gathered from other anarchist sources, either way, it seems like the word has belonged to socialists and not capitalists if we judge by history. Although personally, I really do not care if laissez-faire capitalists call themselves libertarian.
In any case, Tucker would continue to fight the good fight for about 20 years after the Haymarket riot, until his bookstore in New York burned down in 1908. After this, Tucker was pretty tired of arguing with a world full of idiots, and decided to hang up his hat and retire to France for the rest of his life. In his old age, Tucker became less optimistic about the prospects for a free society, saying that the decades of state intervention and corporatism might make it so that even if the state were abolished, monopoly would still be triumphant. However, in the same paragraph of his postscript, he said that anarchists should still not favor state socialism, because that was the direction society was headed in anyway, and someone needed to be around to argue for competition. Around the same time, he also began to believe that civilization as a whole was probably doomed. In private correspondence, though, Tucker also wrote that capitalism is at least tolerable, which cannot be said of state socialism or communism.
Please take notice to the direct contradiction to the earlier argument. which was that Tucker believed in free markets, but only had different predictions to anarcho-capitalists. In this quote, Sun directly contradicts this argument by showing that Tucker, being dismayed by the method of anti-monopolism, meaning that Tucker cared about the ends more than the means. Tucker didn't want a free market just because he liked a free market, but because he believed it was the best way to achieve his vision of libertarian socialism. Speaking on his last quote, any anarchists may agree or disagree. From social to individualist anarchists, there isn't exactly a consensus on whether capitalism is better than state socialism or vice versa. Just to note, isn't it peculiar how Sun has to resort merely to making capitalism out to be the lesser of two evils in Tucker's eyes? It's almost like Tucker was an anti-capitalist.
Tucker's descent into pessimism would mark the beginning of the dark age of anarchism, a period from 1908 until the 1950s when the commies who stole the term predominated, and the flame of individualist anarchism was only kept alive by a handful of people. One of the most important characters from this period was H.L. Mencken, a famous journalist who devoted much of his career to attacking the excesses of government. Because individualist anarchism was so obscure by this point, Mencken did not call himself an anarchist to avoid association with the communist anarchists, but he was certainly familiar with and nostalgic for the old anarchism.
Please note the use of old anarchism to denote that somehow individualism preceded communist anarchism. Nevertheless, we see anarcho-communism mentioned in the likes of Joseph de Jacques, who was active in the lifetime of Proudhon. Strains of individualism and communism were developing at the same time, so the differentiation between old anarchism and new anarchism doesn't make any sense.
How do we know this? Well, there are a few pieces of evidence. Firstly, Mencken would write in 1919 that every normal man must be tempted at times to spit upon his hands, hoist the black flag, and begin slitting throats. The black flag he is referencing is the black flag of anarchism.
Although this quote seems to link Mencken with some kind of appreciation for anarchism, it really doesn't. The place Sun has pulled it from is in the critique of a poetry movement that is unrelated to the subject of this discussion.
Mencken would later publish a dictionary of quotes in which he included several quotes relating to the state from Proudhon and other classical anarchists. Mencken would also explicitly lament the capture of the term anarchism by the communists, at one point writing a denunciation of Tucker's old rival, Johann Most, and contrasting his vision with the philosophy of Mencken's personal hero, Friedrich Nietzsche, who Mencken considered to be an anarchist. He wrote, "It is obvious, of course, that the sort of anarchy preached by Nietzsche differs vastly from the beery, collarless anarchy preached by Herr Most and his unwashed followers. The latter contemplates a suspension of all laws in order that the unfit may escape the natural and rightful exploitation of the fit, whereas the former reduces the unfit to de facto slavery and makes them subject to the laws of a master class, which, insofar as the relations of its own members, one to the other, are concerned, recognizes no law but that of natural selection. To the average American or Englishman, the very name of anarchy causes a shudder, because it invariably conjures up a picture of a land terrorized by low-browed assassins with matted beards, carrying bombs in one hand and mugs of beer in the other. But as a matter of fact, there is no reason whatsoever to believe that, if all laws were abolished tomorrow, such swine would survive the day. They are incompetents under our present paternalism, and they would be incompetents under Dionysian anarchy."
The quote that Sun uses is, of course, talking about Mencken's analysis, the philosophy of Nietzsche, and of course, this is not relevant to the topic at hand. The quote compares that of anarchists to the anarchy preached by Nietzsche, which is a subject of philosophical discussion, not really a political discussion, and it's more about the analysis of Nietzsche's ideas and implications, hence the title and subject of his book, rather than any proof that Mencken was a secret Tuckerite or Boston anarchist. It seems to me that Sun is just slinging shit to the wall to see what sticks.
It is no surprise, then, that Mencken would use Tucker's word libertarian to refer to himself in 1923. And although he didn't use that word often, his use of the word would later be adapted by this new libertarian movement of the 1950s. To understand this new libertarian movement, you have to understand a pretty obscure figure by the name of Frank Chodorov. Chodorov was a writer for Menken's publication American Mercury, and like Mencken, he basically agreed with the classical anarchists, but disdained the communist direction the movement had taken.
As Sun even mentions, libertarian is not Tucker's word. It was being used by communists at the time, and Tucker's use still represents use of the word by left-wing socialists. If Sun wants to say that libertarian was adapted instead of co-opted or stolen, then I do not really have a problem with this, because it is the same claim being reaffirmed under a different vocabulary. Sun goes on to talk about how Chodorov's belief in private property led him back to statism, and oh, do I wonder how that could have happened. Chodorov seems to be responsible for a lot of development for the modern right libertarians, quoting the cry, "Taxation is theft." This would attract young Rothbard, Sun adds, which continues his road to developing anarcho-capitalism. The exact path of Rothbard to anarcho-capitalism is unimportant for this discussion and skipped for your convenience. It is known that Rothbard did get inspired in part by Boston anarchism, and that is what's mainly relevant. Rothbard combined the anti-statism of the market anarchists with the economic perspectives of liberals in the Austrian School of Economics to create his Frankenstein ideology known as anarcho-capitalism.
Proudhon and Tucker had written at a time when the dominant school of economic thought was the classical economics of Adam Smith, which led to their acceptance of the labor theory of value and their belief that interest and rent would be eliminated by free market competition. However, Rothbard's education in the Austrian school led him to reject that idea, and he would merge Mises's economic views with Tucker's political views to form the core of a new ideology which he would later call anarcho-capitalism.
Speculation over whether Tucker or Proudhon would be capitalists if they were born in the modern age is as irrelevant as asking if Rothbard would be communist if he was born in their time periods. This means that speculation on if either of them would use the subjective theory of value is also irrelevant and amounts to whataboutism. Let it be known that their differences were not over minor economic issues or calculations. It is about whether certain activities are exploitative and over whether usury is just or not. To clarify a lot of the implications of differing economic perspectives, Kevin Carson elucidates us that the classic political economy was a revolutionary creed that threatened the interests of the landed oligarchy and the mercantilists, and it was amenable to even more revolutionary uses, as evidenced by the Ricardian socialists. The most famous socialist treatment of Ricardo, of course, is that of Marx, but the socialist development of classical political economy also included free marketers like Thomas Hodgkin, the most preeminent of Ricardian socialists, the mutualist and individualist anarchists from Warren to Tucker to Spooner, and many Georgists. My own work falls within the latter array of petty bourgeois deviationists. But with the triumph of the industrial-owning classes in 1830s, Britain, the focus of political economy shifted from scientific investigations and a radical challenge to the power of the old regime to an apology for the status quo. And again, Tucker did not just have faith in the free market because the free market is always good and is the best thing ever. He used it to the extent of his aims, and his aims were to free the working man from usury, such as rent, interest, and profit. That was the whole basis of his proposals for mutual credit and for occupation and use property norms. There are three forms of usury: interest on money, rent of land and houses, and profit in exchange. Whoever is in receipt of any of these is usurer, and who is not? Scarcely anyone. The banker is a usurer, the manufacturer is a usurer, the merchant is a usurer, the landlord is a usurer, and the working man who puts his savings, if he has any, out on interest or takes rent for his house or lot, if he owns one, or exchanges his labor for more than an equivalent, he too is a usurer. And we saw earlier in his essay on socialism that he believed society was full of two groups, the socialists and the thieves. We can also see and have seen that these are substantial critiques and points of differentiation and are not merely economic predictions that Sun tries to spin it as.
Rothbard would explain this in his essay, The Spooner-Tucker Doctrine, An Economist's View, wherein he would highly praise Tucker along with another individualist anarchist who I'm sure many anarcho-capitalists watching this are aware of, Lysander Spooner. However, Rothbard would also qualify his praise by noting that he objected to their economic views. He wrote, First, I must begin by affirming my conviction that Lysander Spooner and Benjamin R. Tucker were unsurpassed as political philosophers, and that nothing is more needed today than a revival and development of the largely forgotten legacy that they left to political philosophy. I am therefore strongly tempted to call myself an individualist anarchist, except for the fact that Spooner and Tucker have, in a sense, preempted that name for their doctrine. And from that doctrine, I have certain differences. Politically, these differences are minor, and therefore the system that I advocate is very close to theirs. But economically, the differences are substantial. And this means that my view of the consequences of putting our more or less common system into practice is very far from theirs.
Funnily enough, I actually agree with Rothbard in this quote. Anarcho-Capitalism is such a large leap from what the individualists advocated for that it should constitute a separate ideology because it rejects a lot of the core tenets of their ideology. When Rothbard speaks of political differences instead of economic ones, I assume he is mentioning the state versus the economic system respectively. In this sense, Rothbard is similarly not so different politically with our anarcho-communist comrades, but only he is different economically. As we can see, this really doesn't tell us much of anything about what he actually believes. A man who objects to the state, which is to keep a slave economy, would say something similar. Would he be an anarchist? Obviously not. But as Rothbard states, the economic differences are very substantial, since it goes from explicitly anti-capitalist markets to pro-capitalist markets, which changes the name of the game. No longer is the ideology in an anti-authoritarian nature, to reduce exploitation of the masses by the few, then it becomes a system to give liberty to the privileged few at the expense of the all. This would be the system that the individualists would and currently do object to, and should be noted as a rejection of their principles instead of continuing in their creed. Sun doesn't exactly make an argument about this, yet he feels confident enough to move on to defend his savior Rothbard from a few quotes that the anarchists tend to use against him. He first goes over the one about Rothbard proclaiming that they have stolen the word libertarian from the left.
Modern collectivist anarchists often like to cite a couple certain quotes out of context in order to claim that Rothbard and his followers are not anarchists. Firstly, Rothbard wrote, "One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that, for the first time in my memory, we, our side, had captured a crucial word from the enemy. Other words, such as liberal, had been originally identified with laissez-faire libertarians, but had been captured by left-wing statists, forcing us in the 1940s to call ourselves rather feebly true or classical liberals. Libertarians, in contrast, have long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists, that is, for anti-private property anarchists, either of the communist or syndicalist variety. But now we had taken it over, and more properly from the view of etymology, since we were the proponents of individual liberty, and therefore of the individual's right to property."
And this is how Sun tries to spin it.
So there Rothbard is sort of admitting to stealing the word libertarian from the communists. But as I noted earlier, the word libertarian did not come into consistent use by the communists to which Rothbard refers until around the turn of the 20th century, and before that it had been used on and off by both sides, although it was originally coined by the communist Joseph de Jacques. In the 20th century, though, the term was actually first taken by our side on the suggestion of Dean Russell, shortly followed by Frank Chodorov. Chodorov's involvement makes me suspect that this was influenced by his days as an anarchist, but I can't prove that. In any case, in this quote, Rothbard is referring to the word libertarian, not the word anarchist. And somewhat ironically, modern Rothbardians actually have a much better historical claim to the word anarchist than they do to the word libertarian.
What I assume by both sides is that he means between individualist and social anarchists. What is falsely implied by this is that anarcho-capitalists are individualist anarchists, or at least on the same side, which is also false. No actual reasoning was given to put individualists within the same classification as capitalists, i.e. on the right wing, other than they think the free market does different things, which has already been debunked. So there's really nothing more to debunk in this argument. No argument has been made. As proven before, any form of capitalism is inextricably opposed to all forms of mutualism and individualism in the anarchist movement. So Sun has done a very poor job to explain why they have a better claim to the word anarchist than the anarcho-communists do.
Aha, say the collectivists. But what about the Rothbard quote where he says, "We are not anarchists"? Well, let's look at that one in context. The quote is this: "We must conclude that the question, are libertarians anarchists, cannot simply be answered on etymological grounds. The vagueness of the term itself is such that the libertarian system would be considered anarchist by some people and archist by others. We must therefore turn to history for enlightenment. Here we find that none of the self-proclaimed anarchist groups correspond to the libertarian position, that even the best of them have unrealistic and socialistic elements in their doctrines. Furthermore, we find that all of the current anarchists are irrational collectivists, and therefore at opposite poles from our position. We must therefore conclude that we are not anarchists, and that those who call us anarchists are not on firm etymological ground and are being completely unhistorical. On the other hand, it is clear that we are not archists either. We do not believe in establishing a central tyrannical authority that will coerce the non-invasive as well as the invasive. Perhaps then we should call ourselves by a new name, non-archist."
Notice the part of the quote that says, "Here we find that none of the proclaimed anarchist groups correspond to the libertarian position, that even the best of them have unrealistic and socialistic elements in their doctrines." Notice that even the best of them have socialistic elements in their doctrines. So does Sun resolve the blatant rejection of anarchist individualist principles as collectivist? Nope. So please do us all a favor and stop complaining when all people call you anarchistic on historical grounds. Anarcho-capitalism can be seen as distinct from all forms of anarchism and rejects the principles that unify the anarchist movement as socialist. So we do not care to entertain your notions of voluntary anarcho-bosses. Even if anarcho-capitalism has historical connections, I don't think it would make the turd much shinier. Nevertheless, let's see how Sun deals with this quote. Will it be an analysis? Will it use historical evidence? Will it use any evidence at all from their economists?
The first thing to note about this quote is that it's from an article that Rothbard never had published, and it contradicts the angle Rothbard states multiple times in other sources, both before and after this was written in the mid-1950s. Rothbard was calling himself a private property anarchist in private correspondence by 1950, and in Betrayal of the American Right, Rothbard specifically says, "I became an anarchist," and he says the same thing in a talk he gave on his ideological development in 1981.
I became an anarchist.
Just as a couple of quick examples, Rothbard calls himself an anarchist plenty of other times too. Secondly, if you carefully compare this quote to what he wrote in The Spooner-Tucker Doctrine, the only difference is that in that text, he emphasizes that his disagreements with Spooner and Tucker about actual political prescriptions are only minor. Even in the non-anarchist article, his main point is that most of the contemporaries who call themselves anarchists were commies, and he wanted to distance himself from them. And who can blame him? Since the last St. Imier Congress in 1877, the collectivist anarchists had only gotten worse.
The first point could be seen as something that this was never published is certainly a conspicuous detail, and maybe this wasn't Rothbard's final thought on the matter. This is also a bit of a delicious irony, as AnCaps love to gush over Proudhon's unpublished manuscripts on the theory of property. Nevertheless, the reason anarchists bring this up is because it is an indication that Rothbard knew himself that his ideas are necessarily contradictory with everything anarchism has and does stand for. To miss this point is to miss the entire point when anarchists bring this quote up. The fact that Rothbard calls himself an anarchist is not any proof that his ideas are anarchistic, and is a form of the begging the question fallacy. If this is proof that he doesn't agree with the quote because he offers the term non-anarchist instead, is also not a very good argument, because he could be using anarchist just as a term for people to understand colloquially his anti-statism, and that wouldn't require the invention of an entirely new terminology to get people to understand it. On to Sun's second point. No, it was not because of commies, it was because of the socialist influence that is inextricably linked to anarchism. a fact that has been proven time and time again to be held from the likes of Tucker to Kropotkin. I do actually think creating an alternative label would be good for anarcho-capitalists, as it ends a lot of unnecessary strife between anarchists and their opposites. Using a term like voluntarism seems much more fitting to me and has a lot more historical basis. No one is blaming Rothbard, and that is missing the point. Sun wraps up his history lesson before his conclusion covering Chomsky and Bookchin and some other real-life examples of communist anarchism. He finally ends saying,
in any case, I hope that this video has clarified some points about the history of anarchism and the individualist lineage of Rothbardian anarchism, from Proudhon to Sade and Tucker to Mencken and Chodorov to Rothbard. His philosophy of anarcho-capitalism is merely the anarchism of Spooner, Tucker, and Proudhon through the lens of more modern economic analysis. The collectivists, meanwhile, have attempted to obscure the truth at every turn. Bakunin lied about Proudhon and justified the murder of Sade. Then Malatesta betrayed Bakunin and brought the ideology even closer to Karl Marx. And now, Noam Chomsky, who can't even live up to the sincere anti-statism of Malatesta or Kropotkin, has the nerve to say that we're not the real anarchists?
Oh, the irony. Sun is crying about the misrepresentation of the individualists and mutualists, yet constantly and deliberately misreading them at every turn. As we have seen, capitalism in any form is in no way similar to the Boston anarchists, and is in fact not the anarchism of Spooner, Tucker, and Proudhon. With this fact rested, there is not really any basis to the other claims other than trying to make charged statements against the social anarchists, as if that has anything to do with his thesis. It has not been proven that the collectivists have ever been obscuring the truth at every turn, and it comes out as a weak, half-baked, and ham-fisted argument. And with that, Sun feels it necessary to end with a quote by Tucker.
Luckily, their whining doesn't seem to be very effective. AnCaps today have reclaimed the mantle of anarchism from its collectivist usurpers. I'd like to close out with a final quote from Benjamin Tucker on the subject. They cannot answer Proudhon. They will not accept him. They must lie about him. But they should lie more shrewdly.
So if this is the best anarcho-capitalists have on their claims to anarchism, then they should really stay away from the label. Honestly, voluntarism has a lot less baggage than the word anarchism, so maybe they should try going with that. It is probably better branding anyway. And laughably, Sun ends with a quote from Tucker about Karl Marx and not any actual anarcho-communists. Here is the full quote. During the 17 years from 1848 to 1865, Proudhon published, besides many others, the following works: Solution of the Social Problem, Organization of Credit and Circulation, The Bank of Exchange, The Bank of the People. These four, gathered in one volume, constituting his chief constructive works in political economy. Also, The Social Revolution, The Right to Labor and the Right of Property, The Tax on Incomes, Confessions of a Revolutionist, General Idea of the Revolution in the 19th Century, Theory of Taxation, Literary Property Titles, Justice According to the Revolution, According to the Church, and his discussion with Bastiat on interest. Some of these works deal exclusively with political economy, and all deal very largely with it. The line of thought begun in What is Property and continued in The Economical Contradictius is followed out and concluded in these. Marx's criticism did not turn him a hair from his course. He went ahead tirelessly to the day of his death, paying no heed whatever to the German state socialists. And that is just what troubles the latter's followers. They cannot answer Proudhon. They will not accept him. They must lie about him, but they should lie more shrewdly. That about sums up the research integrity for this video, right? Let it be known that the title has been a simple Mott and Bailey, and that it is borderline clickbait. There isn't really a substantial argument that anarcho-capitalism is anarchism in this video. It's just a deliberate misrepresentation of a lot of famous historical anarchists. And I am glad to have gotten this out of the way, as many AnCaps have been fervently telling me to actually read Proudhon while not actually reading him themselves. Feel free to send these videos to anyone who spams Springtime of Nations as a credible source. I guarantee they do not have the resources to make a substantial rejection of my critique of his video. And this is Hades the Mutualist, and I'll see you in the next video.